Welcome to U.S. military media. Putin is going to create the largest army in the world. USA Military Intelligence Service claims that Russia will announce another wave of mobilization in the next few days and will assemble an army of 2 million. At the beginning of Russia's war against Ukraine, Putin thought he would take over the entire territory of Ukraine with his army of 900,000 men at that time. But his plans collapsed disastrously because of Ukraine's armed forces. Since the start of the war, the Russian army has lost more than 120,000 soldiers, and the number of wounded and maimed military personnel may be more than 200,000 more. Putin is trying to make up for these losses. The first mobilization in Russia was announced on September 21, 2022, during Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine and shortly after the Ukrainian armed forces counterattack that resulted in the deoccupation of the entire Kharkov region west of the Oskol River. President Vladimir Putin issued a decree announcing partial mobilization in the Russian Federation. Mobilization activities began on the day the decree was announced, September 21. Then more than 300,000 soldiers were drafted into the army, or trained and sent to the front in Ukraine. After the new wave of mobilization, another 500,000 Russians will join the Russian armed forces, allowing the terrorist country to create strategic reserves. According to U.S. military intelligence estimates, the scale of mobilization activities carried out by the aggressor country indicates that its leadership plans to create an army of about 2 million people. Before the war against Ukraine, the Russian army had about 900,000 soldiers and a reserve of about 2 million people. In comparison, the Ukrainian army was 700,000 men before the war, but now they are talking about the number of more than 1,200,000 Ukrainian soldiers. That the Kremlin intends to mobilize additional forces for a new major offensive was announced by Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in a traditional evening address on January 4, 2023. On December 30, on the eve of the new year, Ukrainian Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov recorded a video address to Russians, where he also warned that the Kremlin was preparing for a new wave of mobilization and already in early January planned to declare martial law and close Russian borders to men. The possibility of a new wave of mobilization in Russia is actively discussed in the Russian-language media, social networks, and Telegram channels. The Kremlin called the announcement of the possible start of general mobilization in Russia a hostile provocation. The summonses that Russians are already receiving fakes, and the stories of Russian citizens themselves about their summons to the military registration and enlistment offices fakes. The Russian authorities try to calm down the Russian citizens by assuring them that there are no grounds for a new wave of mobilization, and there won't be any for at least 6 months. Russians had heard something similar just days before Russian dictator Vladimir Putin signed a decree on partial mobilization in Russia at the end of September 2022. Future Russian conscripts are likely to lead the offensive in the Donetsk, Kharkov, and possibly Zaporizhia regions. At the same time, they will have to defend themselves in Crimea and Kherson region. Kyiv believes that the coming 6 to 8 months is the last push. If Russia loses this time, Putin will collapse. The enemy's goal is still to seize the entire territory of Ukraine. The Russian army suffered the heaviest losses over the past 6 months in the Donetsk region, near Bakhmut, Soledar, and Kremenna. In this region, the main losses are sustained by the Wagner Group. The Ukrainian military claims that over the past 4 to 5 months, the Wagner Group has lost about 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers here. These are staggering figures. It is also worth bearing in mind that most of the Wagner Group consists of prisoners from Russian prisons, where they are recruited by PBC leader Wagner Prigozhin. In return for their service, Prigozhin promises clemency for prisoners. Gromov added that in order to realize its plans, the RF announced a reform of the armed forces, in particular, an increase in its total strength to 1.5 million people and the formation of at least 20 new divisions. Despite such grand plans, according to Gromov, their implementation is rather doubtful. These actions by the Russian government indicate the Kremlin's intentions to prepare for long-term and large-scale combat operations. The reform also affects Russia's military industry. During the 11 months of the war, the Russian army lost more than 3,000 tanks, 250 planes, and about 300 helicopters. The Russian military industry is trying to compensate for all these losses by producing new military equipment at its factories. But due to sanctions, corruption, and the obsolescence of the military industry, Russia is unable to compensate for the loss of equipment in time and is forced to remove old Soviet equipment from storage.